Clint, you know that Moneyball was based on a nonfiction book where Trouble with the Curve is fictional. Indeed, I think it actually has a number cruncher as the evil guy. But what I actually want to do is not talk about movies about number crunching, but a movie where there was number crunching based on the script. And The Interpreters, the movie, I don't know if anybody had a chance to see that a few years ago. It was a Nicole Kidman vehicle. And before a single frame of this movie was filmed, a company called Epigogics did something very cool. It had the audacity, just looking at the script and the budget of promotion, to predict that it would sell $69 million domestic box office. And pretty good prediction. Turned out the actual box office was $73 million. But Epigogics had the double audacity to predict, and by the way, this is a prediction that was not acted upon, to predict that if they had added a young sidekick, that it would sell $12 million more, or that if they had focused the location more on the great Big Apple and the UN, that it would have sold $5 million more. By the way, since this was a non-linear prediction, if they had done both of these things, I think, by the way, they would have predicted it would have sold $20 million more. They didn't, the producers didn't act on this advice, but it shows you the power of predictive analytics. By the way, how do they do this? They crunch numbers on thousands upon thousands of prior movies, and it's so that this idea is not only, number crunching isn't only a topic for movies, but number crunching can improve the bottom line of movies. This is a song called Idaho that I only learned about from using Pandora. Pandora also crunches terabytes of data to help you figure out what kind of songs you like. I put in that I like Bruce Springsteen, and it came back to me with this song. I don't know exactly how they have run their regressions, but it works separately when my daughter puts in Ingrid Michaelson. So both of these are examples of the rise of data-driven decision-making, that we're in this new age where by crunching historical data you can come up with tons of more accurate predictions. Why is this happening? Well, this t-shirt that's being modeled right now, it's by my nephew Marty. I think this is one of the reasons this revolution is occurring. And the joke here is that a lot of people misread this to say there are 10 kinds of people in the world, where the back tells us instead it's those who understand binary and those that don't. You know, there are 1-0 kinds of people in the world. And this digital revolution, the ability to cheaply capture and store mass data sets is very important. YouTube is now acquiring 8 years of content each day, and these databases are monstrously large. Not just terabyte, but exabytes are just coming in by the score. And so super crunching isn't really about new techniques, even though there has been great progress in the statistical techniques. It's centrally about being able to apply actually well-known existing techniques with a size, speed, and a scale that just we haven't seen before. And you don't have to look much beyond Watson to see the power of the size, speed, and scale combined. But I want to look at a rather small data set. This is a picture of Orley Ashenfelter. He's one of the great econometricians in the world. And he applies statistics to economic questions. And this is actually the output of one of his famous regressions on the quality of Bordeaux wines, which has not a terabyte of data behind it, and only controls for, it's not a long or a very wide data set, but it's been quite accurate at predicting Bordeaux wines with just 3 control variables having to do with the winter rainfall and the average growing temperature and the average harvest temperature. By the way, the average growing temperature, you see these coefficients are what come back from the regression. That positive coefficient on the average growing temperature, a convenient truth is that global warming has made Bordeaux qualities quite high in the last decade. But when Orly put forward his results, Robert Parker, who's one of the great traditionalist wine raters, he was not amused by this and said some rather negative things about Orly. And Parker's reaction is one that I see over and over again. I call it the iron law of resistance, that when you come forward and start displacing traditional baseball scouts, traditional wine connoisseurs, they're going to react negatively. But it's even deeper. I find this iron law of resistance even inside me, inside everybody, that we tend to think that what we do is too special to be improved by number crunching. So one of the things to try to, for us to get over is other people's resistance, but also our own. And this idea of predicting the future is happening in area after area. Actually, the epagogics example and Orly's wine examples are quite parallel. Epagogics predicts the success of movies that have not been made. Orly predicts the success of wines that no one has tasted. And indeed, this kind of use of regression, it's also at the core of what eHarmony does. It's a very different kind of dating service. Traditional dating service would ask you, hey, who do you want to go out with? eHarmony instead gives you a personality test, and then they have run regressions on thousands upon thousands of other couples. And again, in a parallel way, they will try to predict your happiness, your probability of love with somebody you've never met. Again, it's a new age of predictive analytics. This is being used again in lots of other contexts. Let me just focus on Ayres. Ayres will make predictions based on dozens and dozens of variables about how much money you can lose and still come back for more. And indeed, once you reach that pain point, they will try to have somebody come up and tap you on the shoulder to break you off from that, so that you don't get to that too much pain, so that you can continue to have a delightful experience as you're lightening your wallet. Of course, there are dozens of Smarter Planet success stories. I want to focus on this last one about Assurant call centers, which I think is a really great take-home point here. Assurant has found that in matching people to the right kind of call center representative, they can do a great job of reducing attrition. They can do a great job with regard to the save rate, the retention rate of clients for extended warranty services and other services. And this matching based on rapport, based on affinity, and based on expertise. If they can predict what kind of question you're going to ask and match you with somebody who can answer it better, you're much more likely to be happy and to stay with them, even if you have to wait longer. See, and without doing the number crunching, it's hard to tell. Are people going to be more upset from waiting, more upset by not getting somebody with rapport, affinity, expertise? And this idea of matching the client with the right representative is one that I think is really underutilized. So part of the goal here that I'd like to emphasize is I agree just completely with what was said in the last panel discussion, that we should be about action items, and really one of the first steps is to go beyond from dashboards to regressions, to actually doing predictions about what's going to happen, so that that's a step forward in trying to move toward action items. This ability to engage in predictive analytics, it has real market value out of here. real market value. You can see in this list of takeovers, these are multi-billion-dollar takeovers. IBM, of course, has been a big player in the takeover field. And one of the things that I think is understated in predictive analytics is that these same regression procedures that help you predict compatibility and eHarmony, or help you predict what song you're going to like in Pandora, the same predictions simultaneously tell you the level of precision of that particular prediction. And being able to use that precision measure, I think, is another attribute that could be used more often. My favorite example of this is Faircast. What used to be called Faircast, it would predict whether you should wait to buy your ticket or you should buy it now based on their prediction on whether the fare was going to increase or not before the flight takes off. This is an old example from 2007 of a flight from New York LaGuardia out to LAX, and the core prediction is that the fare is going to decrease before the flight stays out, so it predicts that you should, it suggests to you that you should wait because the fare is going to drop. But what I love about it, and what is circled in yellow there, is it tells you the confidence of the prediction. There's a lot of data between New York and Los Angeles, and they're right on this kind of prediction 80% of the time. And being able to tell you about that precision, I think, is helpful. By the way, Faircast will also stand behind its prediction by offering you insurance if in case the price rises. And to tell you the value of predictive analytics, this Faircast, it is a business. It's basically a single regression. Somebody came up with this idea. We can get terabytes of data on past fare changes, and we can run a regression to predict what's going to happen. And Faircast was purchased by Microsoft for $115 million. If you could come up with a cool regression idea, you might sell it for $100 million. I mean, it's just, it catches, I mean, lots of people in this room could have done a regression that was behind Faircast. You know, there's some real value here. And this idea of, the other idea that I want to bring in, that of really paying attention to not just the prediction, but the precision, I think is something that there's more take-homes there. So a lot of you are engaged in doing scoring of, let's say, consumer value. Great thing to do, but it could be that you and I have the same value score, but it could be that my score is less precise than yours because there was more data on people like you than on mine. And that maybe we should think about having different action items with regard to you than with regard to me, because mine is less certain, even though we have the same value score. So paying attention to the level of precision is another take-home issue. Now, can super crunching go wrong? Yes. Right? Just ask Lehman Brothers. You go and you make billion-dollar bets. It can go wrong, and and indeed, let me try an experiment with you right now. I'd like you to turn to the person next to you, and in a second, I'm going to ask you to shake their hand as if you're just meeting them for the first time. Try to get over your inhibitions here, and then after a second, I'm going to ask you to freeze, and just freeze at that point when I say stop. So right now, just turn and shake somebody's hand, like you're in church. Now, freeze. And now the thing is, now look at your hands. I was once speaking with a body expert who told me that if somebody's wrist is on top, they're trying to control the relationship. Okay? Now you can let go of each other's hand. Now I actually think that's maybe right if you're standing up facing them, but I think this is an example of number crunching going wrong. I instead think that when you're sitting next to each other, the person who's on the right leans across and their wrist has to be on this. So we can do a little experiment to just maybe this. If your hand was on top and you were seated on the right, raise your hand. Okay, now if you were seated on the left and your hand was on top, raise your hand. Now you're the people that are really trying to control the relationship. can make bad inferences from from data, but one of the things that's been tested hundreds and hundreds of times is even though number crunching can go wrong, it's usually better than empirically aided intuition and experience. And the fact that that number crunching has gone wrong in finance from time to time, it would just be crazy to go to a non-quantitative approach to risk management. And in fact, just to give you an example of how I've been playing in the risk management field, I wrote a book called Life Cycle Investing with Barry Melba about a new way to diversify time. We have very well worked out ideas of how to diversify risk across assets. This was suggesting a way to, with regard to retirement investments, to diversify risk across time. And Barry and I started with a simple theory, which is captured in this little slide here. If you had to choose between which was safer to invest $100 in a first year, $200 in a second year, and $300 in the third year, or to invest $200 in each of the 3 years, I hope you would see that probably the lower way is safer, because you have your exposure to the stock market, this is investments in stock, would be spread more evenly over time, and the top one, you'd be taking more risk because there's more risk that the third year would end up to be a bad year in the stock market. And while people get this, it turns out that empirically, if you, instead of thinking about this in terms of years, this is the mistake people make with regard to decades of their life. They have relatively little in the stock market, risky assets, in their 20s, huge amount in the stock market in their late 50s and 60s. And if it turns out that your late 50s or 60s was the last decade, you're not well diversified on with regard to time. So the question is what can we do about that? People say, well, I'd like to have it more spread out, but you can't invest money that you don't have. And I didn't have much money personally when I was in my 20s to do that, and that's just wrong. You can invest money that you don't have. People, by the way, do it all the time. When they go to buy a house, they invest money that they don't have by going out to borrow some of it. When they go to finance their education, they take out loans. And the thought here, and this is where our simple theory starts to go crazy, is to say you might do better by investing money that you don't have. When you're young, and only when you're young, borrowing some money to help your investment strategy, to help reduce the riskiness of your investment strategy. And this is where I started to go quantitative. Barry and I looked at historical stock data from 1871 through 2009. That's 1871 is the earliest that we could go, and it captures, by the way, the panic of 1873. And we compared two different strategies. The first is a retirement investment strategy that's fairly aggressive but traditional. You put 75% of your savings in stock, in the stock market every year, and 25% in government bonds. And you do that every year. And by the way, we're going to hold constant your savings over your working life. And when we do this, by the way, we end up with 96 cohorts of potential investors. One potential, and these are people that are working and investing for retirement over 45 years. And one cohort starts in 1871, and the final cohort ends and is ready for retirement in 2009. And so for each of these cohorts, we had some of them invest in this more traditional way, 75% in stock, 25% in bonds. The other cohort, we did this crazy thing. It was a diversifying life cycle strategy that started you off with 200% of your savings in stock and then ramped you down to 50%. And how in the world can you invest 200% of your savings in stock? You buy some stock on margin. And it's Right now, by the way, at Interactive Brokers, you can borrow money to buy stock on margin at 1.5% interest. And it turns out that it's been we used real market margin rates to do this. And we, by the way, programmed in a great, not so great difficulty, but we programmed in to this strategy the fact that there'd be margin calls and the chance of wipeouts. But this is only, by the way, this is a ramping down strategy. This was people that started at 200% when they're young, so that if they had $5,000, they'd borrow another $5 and invest $10,000 in stock. But by the time they got to retirement, they'd only have 50% in the stock market. And so what you should see is that the diversifying strategy started out more aggressive than the 75% strategy, but ended up less aggressive. Which of these strategies over these 96 cohorts tended to do better? Well, here's the results. Turned out that the two strategies were actually constructed to have the exact same average return across the 96 cohorts, but the diversifying strategy was 20% less risky. Its standard deviation was down 21%. And why? It's really the same thing that was happening as in that first slide. The blue line is the 75% strategy, and you can see it's not well diversified across time. The savers for retirement start off with relatively little in the stock market and end up with a lot of exposure to the stock market at the end. The diversifying strategy just spreads it out more than this traditional strategy. And it turns out, by the way, that the life cycle investing funds that you see out there right now, they're also ramping down, but it turns out that when you ramp down from 90% to 50%, which is what a traditional life cycle fund does, it doesn't do enough to actually spread your exposure to the stock market. At any rate, this is an idea where saying you can still come up with new ideas on risk management, but you got to take them to the numbers. We, in this book, not only looked at historical numbers, but we looked and see that it worked in the UK, we worked in Japanese data, and we did Monte Carlo simulations until the cows came home. Let me shift to another. This is an idea that's just in development right now. This is an investment idea that I'm just crunching numbers on as we speak, and it's trying an idea that's trying to push on a different problem, and it's the problem of investors that are trapped in high-fee mutual funds. And when I say trapped, it's just trapped because we're all busy people, and a lot of people here don't even know what the fees on their mutual funds are. Turns out that if you have high fees, you're very likely to be getting a lower return. And how can you help busy investors not be asleep at the wheel and actually to change to a more efficient fund? Difficult issue. And so here's a possible way forward that I'm crunching numbers on as we speak. And it's an idea of an improved performance guarantee. And just to be, I hope there's nobody in the audience from Mainstay, because I'm about to insult them. All right. So Mainstay has an S&P index fund that has charges annual fees of 81 basis points. And to my view, that's a ripoff. Vanguard charges 18 basis points, and that's if you're not an institutional investor, where it goes down to 12 or 10. 81 is an embarrassment, all right? But still, there are a lot of people that are invested in Mainstay's S&P fund. How could I, and part of the reasons too, they're busy, they care more about returns than about fees. How can I get their attention to move to something else? I suggest that a Vanguard or a Fidelity or maybe a third-party supplier might produce a new set of funds. This one of which might be called a Better Than Mainstay fund. And what it does is it guarantees you that if you transfer your funds from Mainstay to Fidelity's S&P index, it guarantees you'll end up with more money. And what it's not doing, it's not promising you that the S&P index will go up. It's just promising you a higher return than you get from Mainstay. And to be more specific, it might say, we'll guarantee 100% of the downside in relative performance if you give us 20% of the upside. And that's, by the way, 20% of that 80 basis points, which is a lot. And there are about $170 billion of some crunching that I did, invested in high-fee S&P indexes alone, and that a guarantor could expect profit of about 6.4 basis points. This is, by the way, not exactly riskless arbitrage, because the S&P indexes have some tracking error, but it's pretty close that you are of comparable investments. And in one way to say this, if you compare how many months in the last 15 years has the mainstay fund had a higher return than the Vanguard index fund? 0. Okay? That means it's pretty close to riskless. You'd like to have the opportunity to make these kind of bets. And by the way, besides doing risk, why limit yourself to riskless arbitrage? There are tons of high-fee, actively managed funds that are underperforming low-cost indexes. And so Vanguard might view, or Fidelity might view, its guarantees as a portfolio of guarantees. Some of them will lose out to actively managed fund, but 80-90% of them will win month after month. And crunching some numbers, you could easily expect a 5 basis points profit from these guarantees, which in this industry, 5 basis points of profits is a lot. People would like that. And by the way, Yale has filed a provisional patent on this idea. So I'm crunching numbers on it, but also trying to protect it. Let me shift gears. I've been talking about crunching historical data. I now want to have an ask out here, which is to say, I think probably in this audience where you've been doing lots of predictive analytics and number crunching, my view is that you probably haven't been doing enough randomization, enough controlled randomized experiments. And one way to think about this book, Super Crunches, that I wrote, is in a single sentence, is that any substantial organization that isn't both running regressions on historical data and doing randomized experiments is presumptively screwing up. And I'd suggest that probably there are organizations out here in the audience that are presumptively screwing up, that you could be gaining value by running some more experiments. And here's just a simple example of it. This comes from Monster.com. These are Monsters. This was from a page where they're trying to get employers to use the Monster.com service. And the rest of, I'm not showing you the whole page, but this is a center element. The rest of the page was staying constant. And sometimes they would, for over 100,000 employers, they would show them at random the upper pane, and more than 100,000 employers saw at random were assigned to the lower pane. And Paul, which of these two panes do you think generated more business for Monster.com? The upper or the lower? The lower. And by the way, he said the lower. I also picked the lower. I like the curved icons, are more pleasing to the eye. Okay? We're not doing well though, Paul. Turns out in this randomized experiment, the upper one won. Now, I don't know initially why it won, but one of the powers of a randomized experiment is that you can believe it without even knowing why. That if you trust that Monster randomized, you can still have, this really underscores the power of it. And the reason why it has this power is that randomization is a control. If you randomize between two groups of 200, if you split a group of 200,000 people randomly into two groups, those two groups will have the same proportion of left-handed people, the same proportion of oboists, the same proportion of coffee shops in each group. All right? And the only thing that systematically differs between, and the same distribution of height, the same distribution of everything, the only thing that should differ between those two large randomized groups is that one saw the upper one and one saw the other. So it's not, I don't have to say, oh, did you control for whether they were oboists? The randomization did that. And this is the power of randomization. Now, once we have this result, it's really good to go back and try to think about what was it about this that made it more powerful. Randomized experiments also are valuable because they allow real-time optimization. Another real problem in business action is you do the report, you make the prediction, and I know companies out there that have to do 5 more hour-long meetings before they actually take action. In contrast, Google AdWords will run experiments for you, and they will automatically start shifting the ads toward the winning campaign without any committee meetings. And the extent to which you can get quick results and start acting on them. In fact, here's another kind of rule of whether you're ready to take the next step on this journey for predictive analytics. Is I say before you do a study that's going to cost you a lot of time and bandwidth, presumptively come up with the decision rule that is contingent on the results of the study before you do it. If you can't say before you do the study that at least presumptively I'm going to switch to this if I get this result, then why even do the study? And that will be one way to speed up real-time optimization. Another example from the web that I really love, this shows you that you can also, what you're testing itself can be contingent. This is from musiciansfriends.com. They used to have a one-size-fits-all central element, and they wanted to test, and by the way, they mostly sell guitars, and so they wanted, and they had to have a central element that was mostly guitars. And so they said, well, what if we, instead of just having that one-size-fits-all guitar picture, what if we have pictures that vary depending on what the Google search that sent people here. If they were interested in drums, we'll send them a landing page that has more drums. Turns out when they ran that experiment, they had a substantial increase in click-through rates, and a revenue per visitor went up 15%. That 15% number is a little bit high, but I tell you, if you're not doing randomized experiments on the web, you're really presumptively screwing up. And that it's just routine to get 5, 10%. 10% is pretty routine if you're not doing it. And when I say 10% of what, you tell me what you care about. It can be more registrations, 10% more revenue, very standardized result. And it's the kind of thing that's should be routinized enough. It's not a one and done, but once you start doing these randomized, you should do it periodically to find out what the new pink is. This idea of doing randomized experiments, it's seeping outside of business. Here's a cool experiment that was done by Harvard Law School. They have a clinic that helps people try to pursue disability coverage, disability payments, and they did a randomized experiment. They're oversubscribed, and what was the impact on winning the lottery and getting student representation versus losing the lottery and not being included? And it turns out that it didn't impact the probability of getting your disability benefits at all, but it slowed down how long it took you to get them. That from 53 months if you won the lottery, and only 37 months if you didn't get the students were kind of over-lawyering the process. So this is an example where you actually learned something that the product that you were providing wasn't as helpful as you thought it would be. The idea of this randomization, it also is a great starter drug for predictive analytics if you're trying to, as many of you are, trying to get other people in the organization to buy in. When so often when I'm running regressions on historic data, people say, oh, but did you control for this? Did you control for this? And those are often very reasonable questions, but just as I was talking with Paul before, when I tell you a simple randomized story with enough data, people just have this buy-in. It is, oh yeah, that must be the causal story. Another example comes from eHarmony, which not only runs regressions to predict who you will love, they do lots of randomized experiments on the web. Here's one that has to do with trying to convert more people to registration. Jennifer, can I ask you about this one, please? So, their basic model is that you go to the web and you have to register before they'll give you any content. And they wanted to test Well, is that too harsh? Should we just add in a few links, which are in yellow there, that will, if you click through, you can get a little bit more information? And so your question is, which is going to do better, Jennifer, to get more registrations, left or right? Right. And where are you from? Virginia. Not doing so well for Virginia. It turns out that less information led to more registrations. And they did this on not 100,000, but on millions of people that were randomized to one or the other. And then everything else is the same except which screen they saw. People get distracted and don't register through. So this didn't work here, but one of the other values of randomized studies is you can combine it then with regressions. You get this data on 1 million users, and you can then search for subgroups where more information works. And indeed, at eHarmony, they found that Canada, more information worked a lot better. And indeed, at the time, they went back to the drawing board. At this time, they didn't have any television ads up in Canada, and so giving people some more information about what the heck eHarmony was helped. In the United States, people go to it, they already saw the commercial. So you can combine, there's one of the things, it's not an either or. You should be doing both and looking for places where you can hand off from one to the other. From running historical regressions on data to doing randomized studies and vice versa. And while I've been telling lots of marketing stories, the value of randomization is not just on the web, and it's not just on trying to get to acquire new accounts. It can be used all over the place. And sports strategies is a great example where we don't have enough randomization. And so all you know about the Moneyball revolution, and that how every professional sports team has a predictive analytics group in it now. That's all wonderful news. But from my perspective, these sports teams are presumptively screwing up, because sports teams are not running randomized experiments on how to improve their business. It's not good enough to just run to look at historical data. And so in fact, hopefully this very next week, I'm just going to get a trove of historical data on pitching. So there are two different perspectives on pitching that I'll just mention briefly. One is, how can we help pitchers pitch better? And one thing to do is to run a simple randomized experiment. Who should be calling the pitches? Should it be the catcher? Should it be the manager in the dugout? Or should it be Watson? Okay? And the natural way I think that should be tested is you should run a randomized experiment. There are lots of at-bats, and at random, sometimes have the catcher call the pitches. At random, sometimes have the manager call the pitches, and at random, sometimes have Watson call the pitches. And indeed, this could be a double-blind experiment. There's no reason that the pitcher or the hitter needs to know who was calling the pitches. And you'd learn very quickly, and by the way, I'd be betting on Watson for these things. What I'm about to turn on is actually not to help pitchers, but to try to help batters. And this is another way that I want to emphasize to combine regression and randomized testing. So stage one is I'm going to get a crap load of pitching data, and I'm going to try to come up, crunch the historical numbers and come up with a real-time algorithm to predict what the next pitch is going to be. Right? Stage two is I'm then going to have a perspective test where my real-time algorithm will sit in a dugout next to a pitching coach and maybe a hitter from this team, and try to see who's more accurate at actually predicting the next pitch. And then the third test is really using randomization. I want at random send signals to batters that some batters I'll give the prediction and some people I won't. And will it actually, if I could tell a batter that there's an 80% chance that the next pitch is going to be a changeup, will that help the batters hit it? And don't know the results of this, but what I do know, have strong confidence, is that running experiments can help sports teams in ways that they haven't caught on yet. Outside of sports, Here's an example. That's a young Alec Baldwin. Let me say, I have more than 60 co-authors. I'd love to get another co-author from this. I think that somebody in the audience and I might run what I'll call a Glenn Ross test. And so Alec Baldwin in that movie, here's a quotation of him. He said, "These are the Glengarry leads. And to you, they're gold, and you don't get them. Why? Because to give them to you would be throwing them away. They're for closers." He was talking to mediocre salespeople, including Lemon. Who's that guy? Anyway, he was talking to mediocre salespeople. Not John Lennon. Who's the Jack Lemmon. Right. And famous scene. I think it might be wrong. All right, that good leads should only go to good salespeople. No. There's some leads that are so golden, you should probably give them to mediocre salespeople. Anybody could close those leads. You might do better as a business to match your best salespeople with the more challenge. You don't want to give them waste their time, but you might want to use them on ones where they're the only ones that could make the conversion. And what this, by the way, this idea of a Glenn Ross test is very much related back to that earlier example I mentioned of Assurant. Assurant matches people that are calling into their call center with their correct call service representative. You could do that with regard to who you're going to match your leads with. And again, experimentation is a natural way to do it. You come up with a rule-based algorithm and then test. Well, what if I violate the rules? Well, do I do better or not? And even lower hanging fruit, where I think many of your organizations are screwing up, is with regard to apologies. Substantial organizations should have a data-driven apology policy, and almost nobody does. FedEx is a great company, but they don't always deliver their packages on time. What should they do when they don't? Silence? Should they send a letter? Continental did an experiment. They looked at people who had experienced a transportation event, which is an event you don't want to have happen to you, okay? And they put them at random into 3 groups. A third got nothing. A third got a automatically generated letter, and a third got a letter plus a month free subscription to the Admirals Club. And it turned out that the simple letter beat nothing by a lot, that even you'd think people would be so jaundiced, but that it succeeded at retaining business. But the real winner was the free months to the Admiral Club. It turned out, this was a surprise, it created a separate upselling moment, that enough people after the month was over started buying subscriptions to the Admirals Club. So it won both on retention and on upselling. Let me turn more to the personal on randomized experiments. So I'm obsessed with something called commitment bonds, where you put money at risk to if you don't follow through on a goal. And can commitment bonds work? Well, a buddy of mine, Dean Carlin, he did a randomized experiment on the impact of commitment bonds with regard to quitting smoking, and it dramatically increased the success rate. Dean and I care enough about this that we co-founded a company called Stick.com, where you can go and choose your goal, put money at risk. Indeed, users now have put more than $10 million at risk, and we have an 80% success rate. We're a highly data-driven startup, but I take this to be more than a business opportunity. Like the Hair Club for Men president, I'm not just the co-founder of Stick, but I crunch numbers on myself. I put $500 a week at risk a few years ago when I was tipping the scales over 200 pounds. The red line is my daily weight. The blue line is my forfeiture line. Any day that the red line went above the blue line, I had to forfeit $500 to a charity that I didn't like. And what is amazing about this isn't the first half, well, it's just, look, not that there's anything truly amazing. Lots of people, though, lose weight for 3 or 6 months, but the second half of that graph is unusual. To have how flat it is in the second half of the year. I had lost weight 3 times beforehand, but I yo-yoed, and this stopping the yo-yoing was important. I'm deeply into self-quantification. This is a Wi-Fi scale where I tweak my weight if you want to go to Ian weight. Quantification also can help you marketize your events. This is a very unusual eBay auction item. I don't know if you can see it. It says, buy Ayres right to gain weight and earn between $0 and $26,000. If you remember, I put $500 at risk each week. $500 a week times a year is $26,000 if I forfeited every week. I was very careful in the detail, and this is also unusual to have a seller on eBay to say, it would be foolhardy to bid very much on this. I explained to them that I was a co-founder of Stick and that I probably wouldn't forfeit any money, so don't bid anything on this. People didn't follow me, and I was paying $282, and that's real money, not to lose weight. And by the way, I didn't donate that to charity because I wanted that person to keep me honest. So this idea of number crunching, it's one that I take personally. I also used it in selecting the very title of the book. I went into this project saying, I like the end of intuition. It sounds serious, meaty, but I put up a Google AdWords experiment, and it turned out that super crunchers beat my intuition. And so what's the future of intuition? People should still generate ideas, but increasingly the best decision makers need to put their intuitions to the test. Thank you very much.